What's up everyone, this is Dr. James DiNicolantonio. I'm going to be doing a tutorial on acid-base balance. So this is going to be really important if you are on an animal-based diet, if you are an athlete, or if you have like diabetes or you have poor nutritional intake. This is going to be an important video for you to watch. Okay, so one of the biggest questions that I get is, can the body become acidic through diet? And can you make the body alkaline? And the answer to both questions is yes, although the body will not remain alkaline for very long. But we have numerous randomized studies in athletes that if you give things like sodium citrate or sodium bicarbonate, which are supplements, you will, acutely spike the blood pH, making it more alkaline. And that has been shown to improve athletic performance and recovery, because when you strenuously exercise, you induce what's called anaerobic metabolism, and you increase the production of acid in the body. And it's the acid that leads to delayed onset muscle soreness, or at least partially a contributor. It's not the lactate, actually. It's the associated hydrogen ions or protons, which is the actual acid in the body that causes muscle soreness, in addition to inflammation and obviously overactivity of the muscle as well. And the biggest question and the biggest sort of, conundrum that people kind of, look on the internet and try to find, reliable sources is, does the diet affect the acid-base balance of the body? Okay, and I've published a couple of papers on this. So I'm going to sort of take some of that data that I've published and also data from others to sort of kind of cover how this works. This is extremely complex. Now, over the long run, a lot of people say you can just breathe out acid, but there's a cost to doing that. So in order to breathe out hydrogen ions or protons, which are the acid in your body, you have to basically deplete the body of one molecule of bicarbonate. So you're really not altering the acid-base balance of the body in the long run, because you are depleting one molecule of bicarbonate per molecule of hydrogen. So the body has to call upon the kidneys to get rid of acid in order to meaningfully, over the long term, alter the pH of the body. And the negative effect too of trying to breathe out a lot of acid is, again, you're depleting your bicarbonate stores. And then there's negative effects of actually eliminating a lot of acid out the body with the kidneys, because your kidneys can do that, but they have a limited capacity to do that as well. So I'll get into that, later on in this video. So let's sort of talk about, where does base and acid even come from in the diet? So essentially, acid-forming foods are basically grains, and animal foods are your main acid-forming foods. Now, you can also consume like things like soda, which is high in phosphoric acid, which can also contribute to the acid load. But essentially, animal foods like meat, eggs, and cheese, which I eat and I think is healthy, but I do think it needs to be balanced by some type of base, essentially forms a lot of hydrogen ions or protons, which again is the acid in the body. So basically, animal foods are high in sulfur-containing amino acids like cysteine and methionine, and that produces a lot of hydrogen ions. And they're also high in other substances like phosphoserine and other phospholipids, which again contributes a lot of hydrogen ions. Now, the base in the body is things like citrate. So there's citric acid in fruits, there's gluconate and malate in fruits and vegetables, and those substances are the base in the body. So citrate and bicarbonate are base in the body, and they come from fruits and vegetables. So there's this balancing act that's going on in the body between, animal foods, which are going to contribute more to the acid load, and then basically fruits and vegetables or alkaline waters. And actually, this is a question I get a lot all the time too. It's not the pH of the water that will affect your acid-base balance. It's very negligible. So if you're consuming like a water with a pH of 9, the only way that is going to affect or make you more alkaline is if it actually contains bicarbonate or citrate. That's the only thing that matters. The pH, so let's say a pH of 7 water versus a pH of 9 is going to have basically no effect on your acid-base balance. So it is basically a myth that ingesting high pH waters is going to have anything to do with affecting the pH of the body. It comes down to, does that water actually contain bicarbonate or citrate? And it has to actually be somewhat low in sulfate. Otherwise, you're going to have some other negative consequences around the acid-base balance. And I can potentially cover that too. But essentially, I mean, it boils down to the fact that if you're consuming an animal-based diet, then you do want to consume some type of what's called alkaline forming substance, whether that is alkaline mineral waters, whether that is alkaline supplements like sodium citrate or sodium bicarbonate, or plants, okay, if you tolerate them, fruits and vegetables essentially. And you do, though, and most fruits and vegetables aren't a one-to-one match in regards to like animal food. So if you consume 8 ounces of meat, you're typically going to have to consume a lot more than 8 ounces of vegetables to offset that, fully offset that acid. Now, you don't have to fully offset it, but when your urinary pH is 6.5 or less, that's highly indicative that you are retaining some of that acid, because the kidneys have a set capacity to excrete acid. And essentially, in order to then eliminate the retained acid, you have to deplete your bicarbonate stores, and you're also producing a lot of ammonia in order to eliminate that acid out of the kidney. So there's a cost, because ammonia is toxic to the kidneys. Now, we don't exactly know how much dietary acid will lead to how much ammonia, which will lead to X, harmful effect. But animal studies are clear that ammonia is toxic to the kidneys. It can lead, in producing a lot of acid in the body, can lead to what's called kidney hypertrophy and potentially kidney damage. So I hope that explains a little bit around, okay, where are we getting acid? What is acid? Technically, acid is hydrogen bound to water in the body. It's called a hydronium ion, H3O+. That's how it exists in the body. But it's essentially the hydrogen ions, which are called protons. And a lot of those come from animal foods, and that's the acid. And then the base is the citrate and the bicarbonate. And the reason why it's base is because those substances can literally bind hydrogen. One citrate molecule can bind 3 hydrogens, which then forms citric acid, which then turns into CO2 and water, and you breathe out the acid. You get rid of 3 hydrogen ions per citrate molecule. Citrate can also turn into bicarbonate, and you have these bicarbonate forming substances, again, not just citrate, but malate and gluconate from fruits and vegetables, things like that. And 1 molecule of bicarbonate can get rid of 1 molecule of hydrogen. So that's, from a dietary perspective, how it works. Now, from a kidney excreting capacity, normal healthy kidneys can get rid of between 40 and 70 milliequivalents of acid before there is some retention, which then calls upon your bicarbonate stores to basically become depleted in order to get rid of it, to breathe it out. Now, as you get older, so if you're 55 or older, your capacity to excrete that acid before there is some retention goes down by about 8 milliequivalents. So you used to be able to get rid of, let's say, 40 to 70 before there was some retention. That'll go down by about 8 milliequivalents by the time you're 55. So as you age, as your kidney function goes down, your ability to excrete acid before there is some retention goes down. Okay, and that means you're gonna have to deplete more of your bicarbonate stores in order to breathe that acid out. Okay, and then what exactly is occurring in the kidneys in order to get rid of the acid? Well, in order to get rid of the hydrogen ions, the kidneys have to create or produce or synthesize ammonia. Okay, and that will bind to the hydrogen and form ammonium, and then it can be excreted out in the urine. That's a problem, though. You don't want to produce high amounts of ammonia in order to excrete high amounts of acid. So your kidneys can do it, but the animal studies are clear that ammonia is toxic to the kidney. So you don't really want to be producing a ton of ammonia to get rid of a lot of acid from, let's say, a high animal-based diet that doesn't contain bicarbonate forming substances. The other problem too, not just the fact that ammonia is potentially toxic to the kidneys, so it is toxic to the kidneys. We know that. We just don't know if that extra ammonia per se from, let's say, a high animal-based diet is definitively toxic to the kidneys. We still need more information, and on what level does it actually become damaging. But based on the evidence, I think chronically ingesting very high amounts or endogenously producing very high amounts of acid without offsetting the base will likely lead to some kidney damage, because we have randomized studies in people who have, let's say, low-grade metabolic acidosis. When you give them alkaline-forming substances, it improves kidney health and it improves bone health. So that's really one of the quick ways you can test to see if altering your acid-base balance actually does have a negative or positive effect. You got to take someone who actually has metabolic acidosis, give them alkaline-forming supplements, and we have numerous randomized trials to show this, because then you can see if there's a negative or a beneficial effect fairly quickly. Because you can only do these studies for maybe a year or two. People aren't going to do 5 to 10 year randomized controlled studies, and you can quickly see benefits on markers of kidney function and bone health when you improve metabolic acidosis with alkaline supplements. So it's likely that if you have low-grade acidosis chronically for a long time, that will be damaging to the kidneys and to bone health, because you're seeing improvements in just a year from adding alkalinity from supplementation in these randomized controlled trials. But the other thing is, when you produce ammonia, you are basically stripping muscle and connective tissue for the glutamine to actually form ammonia. So you're breaking down muscle and connective tissue to get the glutamine to produce the ammonia to then excrete the acid. So there's two harmful effects. You are breaking down connective tissue and muscle to make the ammonia, and then the ammonia is toxic to the kidneys. You don't want to have to excrete a ton of acid. You can do it, but there's a cost, right? There's a few other costs as well. I just talked about how there will be some retention if you are eating a really high dietary acid load. So what does that mean? Like, a typical Western diet produces 50 to 100 milliequivalents of acid, which is above the threshold 40 to 70 before there's some retention. And how much retention occurs is about 1 milliequivalent of acid for every 2.5 milliequivalents of acid above that threshold gets retained. And then you have to deplete your bicarbonate stores to breathe it out. Okay, so there's harmful effects to, again, excreting a lot of acid, because you have to deplete your bicarbonate stores to breathe that out. You also have to break down the bone. So there have been numerous balance studies from the 1960s that show that a high dietary acid load leads to a lot of calcium loss through bone breakdown. So what will happen is basically acid in the body will stimulate osteoclasts to break down the bone. We don't know if they're doing this on purpose in order to get the carbonate and the calcium from the bone to help eliminate the acid, or if it's just a harmful effect that as the fluid pH in the body goes down, that stimulates the osteoclasts. It's probably a combination of both, but essentially you are going to break down the bone in order to basically help the body eliminate the acid. And there's a few reasons why this happens. It takes the body a little bit of time to actually increase the synthesis of ammonia to get rid of that extra acid. So in the meantime, in order to help get rid of the acid, really, remember I said the sulfur-containing amino acids drive a lot of the hydrogen. Well, they also increase the production of a negatively charged sulfate. And the lungs can't breathe out sulfate, and we don't utilize all of our dietary sulfate. So about 2/3 has to be eliminated by the kidneys, but the kidneys have to maintain what's called electroneutrality. In order to do that, they have to eliminate a positively charged molecule. So essentially, until the body can increase the synthesis of ammonia to help get rid of the acid, it has to strip minerals from your body if your diet isn't high enough in minerals to basically help get rid of that extra acid in the form of the sulfate molecule that comes with the hydrogen from the animal foods. And so that negatively charged sulfate is going to pull positively charged things like sodium, 2 sodiums for 1 sulfate, because sulfate has a -2 charge, 2 potassiums or 1 magnesium or 1 calcium, because those are divalent, or they have 2 positive charges. So you're stripping minerals until you can actually increase the production of ammonia to get out that acid. And then when you start producing a lot of acid and you start hitting that limited capacity, the body's going to rely more on those alkaline minerals to get rid of that negatively charged sulfate, because it, again, has to maintain electron neutrality in the kidneys. So it can't just eliminate a negatively charged sulfate. It has to pull positively charged molecules with it. And so that's why alkaline minerals are called that, like calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. They're not alkaline themselves. They don't bring citrate or bicarbonate. They allow the body to get rid of that negatively charged sulfate from animal foods, and that's why they're considered alkaline. And so we have this balancing act that if you're consuming a high amount of acid, you really need to be balancing that with some type of base. Now, people will say, well, the blood pH doesn't really change. Well, it does, first of all, if you're consuming chronically a high dietary acid load. You start at about 7.45 to 7.42, and it will slowly go down. In other words, your blood literally does become more acidic, even in the quote-unquote normal range. So if you have a blood pH less than 7.4, that's likely indicative of what's called low-grade metabolic acidosis. Okay, but the reason why the blood maintains a very tight range for pH, 7.35 to 7.45 is considered normal, is because the blood has these proteins, albumin and hemoglobin, that can bind the acid, okay? But the interstitial fluid does not have nearly as many proteins. So what ends up happening is the interstitial fluid will become much more acidic much earlier on, even when your blood pH looks normal, and especially if your blood pH is below optimal, below 7.4. Okay, and the reason why the interstitial fluid becomes more acidic is because our biology has basically a weak link, and that is, in order to eliminate metabolites, basically metabolic waste products from cells, we have to have a driving force into the capillaries in order to get rid of these metabolites, okay? And that driving force is basically a high colloid oncotic pressure to drive metabolites into the capillaries. If our interstitial fluid had a lot of proteins like albumin and hemoglobin, then that could bind the acid, which would be great from that aspect. Then that would increase the colloid oncotic pressure, and now you wouldn't be able to get metabolic waste into the capillaries. It would be driven into the interstitial fluid, which is what surrounds all our cells. You don't want that to happen. So we have a weak link in our basically physiology in regards to our interstitial fluid is very susceptible to becoming acidic, and nobody is measuring interstitial pH when we look for metabolic acidosis. We only look at blood. And again, the blood stays normal for a long time. Now, but metabolic acidosis isn't acid in the blood. That's acidemia. Metabolic acidosis is acid in the body, which is the interstitial fluid, and that can happen decades before the blood. At least there's numerous animal studies that have shown that even before disease, the interstitial fluid becomes acidic, and that can lead to things like insulin resistance and many other issues, okay? And so no one's testing interstitial pH. So there are different markers you can look at. The easiest one would be, if you're wondering, is my diet acidic or producing a lot of acid, is you take a urinary pH test strip about 4 hours after you've eaten, because if you take it within 4 hours of eating, there's something called the alkaline tide, and you might look alkaline even when you're not. So you never want to do a morning urine pH on a test strip. You always want to do it about 4 hours after eating, or more, or longer, okay? And that will tell you if your diet is highly acid producing. And if your ideally you want your urinary pH to be 7. If it's 6.5 or less, you're likely retaining acid and depleting your bicarbonate stores. So you want to try and bump your urinary pH to around 7, okay? Now, Vivu, they have urine test strips, and basically you just pee on the test strip. There's an app, you download the Vivu app, and you get your results in like 90 seconds. But that's one way to test for, is my diet acid producing? And then C, you simply want to offset that by alkaline mineral waters that contain bicarbonate, Sodium citrate is what I do. I typically take about 2 grams of sodium citrate with my meals, and I try to make sure there's some carbs with those meals because sodium citrate can be a little tough on the stomach. I'm not usually too bad at 1 to 2 grams. Sometimes I don't even have carbs when I take that amount. But usually that's enough to offset my acid load for my animal-based diet. So you might just be asking, Dr. James, tell me what the heck I need to do here. And I can't give advice, but that's what I do. I basically just take 1 to 2 grams of sodium citrate with each one of my animal-based meals. And then I check my urinary pH. And when I do that, my urinary pH is always good. So I know that that's enough, and that's offsetting the acid load of my diet. There are many other ways to test for acidosis in the body, though, not because I'm just talking about acid load from the diet. Like, you might want to be like, well, do I have low-grade metabolic acidosis? Well, short of testing interstitial fluid pH, you're not going to fully know, but serum bicarbonate is a decent way to test for. You want to be in the optimal range, which is 27 milliequivalents to 30. You'll be considered normal at 23 to 30, but really 27 is optimal, or 27 to 30 of a fasting serum bicarbonate. Blood pH too, you don't want to be less than 7.4. 7.4 to 7.43 is more ideal. Even though, again, quote unquote normal blood pH would be 7.35 to 7.45. Okay. Again, this stuff is really complicated, so I hope this video is sort of helping. But I know it's a lot of information. But you can just look up some of my papers. You can just type in DiNicolantonio, acidosis, and you can pull up some of my review papers on this stuff. Besides that, what else can cause acidosis in the body besides dietary effects? Diarrhea and vomiting can lead to what's called metabolic alkalosis. Hyperventilating can lead to respiratory alkalosis. And then metabolic acidosis is much more common, though. Alkalosis doesn't last very long. If it did, you would probably die. It's the acidosis that lasts a long time. And this occurs when numerous things can cause it. Thiamine deficiency. If you're not getting enough thiamine, what ends up happening is your metabolism shifts over from aerobic to anaerobic. And you may know that anaerobic exercise leads to an increased production of lactic acid, which actually lactic acid doesn't exist in the body. Basically, it dissociates instantly into lactate and the hydrogen ion, or the acid. And it's the acid of lactic acid that's the problem. Lactate is actually a helpful molecule. So anaerobic exercise can increase the acid load of the body, but chronic exercise upregulates your ability to sort of handle acid. So exercise is actually a great way to reduce basically acid buildup, because it allows you to get rid of acid better out of the cell through circulation, things like that. So chronically adapting to the acidosis that's produced is a good thing. But thiamine deficiency, anything that will cause dysfunction of the mitochondria, will increase the acid load, because you start shifting over more to anaerobic metabolism, which leads to a greater production of hydrogen ions. Diabetes is technically an acidic state. Their interstitial fluid pH is typically, at least the animal studies show this, is basically low. The pH is low, their interstitial fluid is acidic, partly because ketone bodies are acidic. And when you are diabetic or you have insulin resistance, you're not able to utilize glucose very well. You start burning more fat, you start producing more ketones, and ketones are acidic, aka keto acids, right? And it's the beta hydroxybutyrate anion, and it's the hydrogen acid that dissociates with those ketone bodies. And that's why you can become acidic. It's called diabetic ketoacidosis. Chronic ketosis doesn't really lead, in my opinion, to any type of significant metabolic acidosis, because your body becomes adapted to those ketone bodies. The larger spikes that originally occur go down. I don't really consider chronic ketosis that much of a metabolic acidic state. It is a little bit, but not anything significant, in my opinion. What does become a clinically metabolic acid condition is chronic fasting. Once you hit 48 hours of a chronic fast and longer, the body is producing so many keto acids that the body does become low-grade metabolic acidosis. And that's why there is increases in calcium and magnesium loss as the body's breaking down bone. I did talk about thiamine deficiency and the anaerobic metabolism. Anything that causes a dysfunction of the mitochondria will increase production of hydrogen ions. We talked about diabetes as being and insulin resistance as being a contributor to acid load, but also decreasing kidney function. Anyone who has a lower amount of kidney function is going to be at more risk for acidosis. So I hope this video was helpful. I'm going to start doing some more of these. Instead of like having to listen to a 4-hour podcast, you can listen to 25 or 30 minutes, and I'll just take a deep dive on a topic and you can just get all the really good information in 25, 30 minutes.